There are days when the sky simply marks another astrological movement, and then there are days that seem to redraw the invisible map of your emotional life forever. Today belongs to the second kind. Before this weekend is over, you may realize that what you believed about love, about your relationships, and even about your own value has quietly begun transforming beneath the surface long before your conscious mind could recognize it. That is why the atmosphere feels different. That is why your heart may already be reacting before your thoughts can explain why. Saturday, July 11th, carries an exact opposition between Venus and the North Node, and every part of that statement matters. Venus governs affection, attraction, personal values, self-esteem, and the ways we exchange love with other people. The North Node represents the future direction of the soul, the unfamiliar path that asks you to evolve beyond old emotional habits. Their opposition is not loose, symbolic, or approximate. It is exact to the degree, an extraordinarily precise alignment that resembles an intricate cosmic equation, arriving at its unavoidable conclusion. The point of impact is not somewhere far away in the collective. It is aimed directly at your emotional world, your closest connections, and the unconscious patterns that have quietly shaped the way you give love, receive love, seek validation, and define your worth for far longer than you may realize. What makes this moment even more extraordinary is that it does not stand alone. Think of it as the first movement in a much larger sequence that continues unfolding over the next 72 hours. One planetary activation awakens another, and another follows after that, creating an almost relentless momentum that carries you into Monday with an entirely different emotional landscape than the one you entered this weekend with. That is not dramatic language. It is a reflection of how concentrated these astrological signatures truly are. Hidden inside this exact opposition is a single karmic decision that will quietly determine the direction many people take, without them even recognizing that they have reached a crossroads. Ironically, the choice that matters most is also the easiest one to overlook because it disguises itself as something ordinary, familiar, and emotionally comfortable. We will return to that deeper layer later, but first it is important to understand why this entire weekend already feels unusually intense. Perhaps you have noticed subtle emotional pressure building for days without any obvious explanation. Maybe an unexpected heaviness has settled into your chest. Perhaps old conversations keep replaying in your mind. Forgotten emotions have resurfaced, or someone you believed had disappeared from your life has suddenly crossed your thoughts or reached out after years of silence. None of these experiences are random. They are not products of imagination or coincidence. They are reflections of a much larger energetic movement that is already unfolding around you and within you. The emotional weight you are carrying has a source, and astrology offers an explanation that is remarkably consistent with what so many people are beginning to experience. To understand why this particular alignment carries such extraordinary significance, you have to step back and look at the broader picture. Astrologers have pointed toward July of 2026 for years, recognizing it as one of the most transformational periods in modern astrology. During this remarkable chapter, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto have each entered new zodiac signs, something that has not occurred together for generations. These are not ordinary planetary shifts. They symbolize profound restructuring across every level of collective life, altering long-established systems, beliefs, priorities, and patterns that have defined humanity for decades. Against that immense backdrop, the Venus opposition taking place on July 11th functions almost like a deeply personal activation point. While the outer planets describe sweeping changes affecting the collective world, this specific Venus alignment directs that same transformational force into one of the most intimate areas of your existence, your relationships, your emotional attachments, and the way your heart understands love itself. Only 2 days earlier, on July 9th, Venus entered Virgo, quietly changing the emotional atmosphere before most people even realized what had happened. Since that ingress, you may have found yourself looking at your relationships differently. Instead of simply feeling your emotions, you may have started examining them. Questions become louder. Doubts become sharper. Your mind searches for flaws, inconsistencies, and unanswered concerns. Some people experience this as increased discernment, while others feel growing anxiety or emotional restlessness. Neither reaction is accidental. Venus in Virgo naturally shifts love away from pure feeling and toward careful observation. Affection begins seeking evidence. Devotion wants proof. Emotional security starts measuring details that previously went unnoticed. Yet this very gift of discernment carries its own hidden challenge. The moment love becomes something you evaluate, it can easily become something you criticize. Instead of allowing connection to breathe naturally, the mind begins assigning value, identifying imperfections, comparing expectations with reality, and quietly keeping emotional score. That analytical current is now moving directly toward one of the most karmically significant points in the sky. As Venus reaches today's exact opposition, everything hidden beneath the visible surface of your closest relationships has the potential to rise into full awareness. Emotions that have remained buried, truths that have been postponed, unresolved wounds, silent disappointments, and unspoken longings may suddenly become impossible to ignore. Whether you feel prepared or not, the emotional tide is moving inward, revealing what has always existed beneath appearances. There is another part of this alignment that deserves your full attention because history shows it repeating itself again and again whenever this particular configuration appears. Many of you may encounter someone connected to your past before this weekend comes to an end. This possibility is not based on fantasy. It is one of the most consistently observed patterns associated with this astrological signature. While Venus stands opposite the North Node, it simultaneously joins the South Node on the opposite side of the axis. The South Node functions like the soul's archive, preserving karmic memories, emotional habits, familiar attachments, and unfinished experiences carried forward from previous chapters of life. When Venus reaches this point, doors connected to the past often begin opening. Former romantic partners may reappear. Old friends may unexpectedly reconnect. Someone whose story with you never truly reached completion may return through a conversation, a message, a chance encounter, or even through a powerful flood of memories that arrives without warning. What makes this experience especially complex is that it rarely announces itself through fear or obvious conflict. Instead, it often arrives wrapped in familiarity, comfort, nostalgia, and emotional warmth. That gentle feeling is precisely why so many people underestimate the significance of what is unfolding. And it is also why the deeper karmic lesson hidden within this remarkable weekend requires far more awareness than it first appears to demand. What makes this moment so difficult is that nothing about it will immediately appear dangerous. Quite the opposite. If someone from your past enters your world again, whether through an unexpected conversation, a simple message, a chance encounter, or even through memories that suddenly become impossible to ignore, the emotional atmosphere surrounding that connection may feel surprisingly peaceful. It can resemble rediscovering a favorite sweater that disappeared years ago and still fits with effortless familiarity. Your entire body may respond before your mind has the opportunity to question it. Your breathing becomes easier. Your shoulders soften. Your nervous system settles into a calm that feels almost impossible to resist. Every shared memory, every familiar expression, every old emotional rhythm may whisper that you have finally returned to a place where you belong. Yet, this is exactly where your awareness becomes more important than ever. I want you to remember this because it could completely change the way you experience this weekend. The comfort itself is not necessarily proof that something belongs in your future. Sometimes comfort is simply evidence that your nervous system recognizes what it has practiced for a very long time. The South Node does not reopen old doors because destiny wants you to move backward. Its purpose is far more profound. It brings unfinished chapters back into your awareness, so you can demonstrate that your soul no longer depends on repeating them. Instead of offering a second chance to relive the past, it offers an opportunity to reveal how much you have actually evolved beyond it. That is why this moment feels so karmically significant. It is less about reunion and far more about recognition. The universe is quietly asking whether you have truly released the emotional patterns that once defined you, or whether they still hold authority over your decisions. Think of this alignment as an examination that measures growth rather than memory. Your response during this weekend has the potential to influence the direction of your relationships for years ahead because this timing carries enormous astrological weight. In only 2 weeks, the lunar nodes will complete their journey across this axis and move into Aquarius and Leo. After they leave Virgo and Pisces, they will not return to this same polarity for another 18 years. That means the karmic lessons this nodal axis has been presenting since early 2025 are approaching their conclusion. The cycle is closing. The curriculum is ending. What remains now is the final opportunity to reveal what has genuinely changed within you. This does not feel like a gentle review before graduation. It feels much closer to a decisive final examination where every emotional instinct reveals something important about the level of consciousness you have actually reached. If someone from your history suddenly appears, or if powerful emotions connected to your past begin rising unexpectedly, give yourself permission to pause before acting. Resist the impulse to answer immediately. Resist the urge to interpret every emotional wave as destiny. Simply observe what is happening inside you. Become curious about your own reactions instead of becoming controlled by them. Ask yourself one question with complete honesty. Is this experience encouraging me toward the future my soul is trying to create, or is it quietly inviting me to return to a version of myself that I have already outgrown? That single question may become the most valuable guide you have during this entire transit because the answer contains far more truth than the emotional intensity of the moment itself. From here, another layer of this karmic alignment begins revealing itself. And I believe every person moving through this transit is being invited to make three deeply important choices about love. The first lesson may be the most uncomfortable because it asks you to release something that has probably felt like an expression of devotion for much of your life. It asks you to stop carrying responsibilities that never truly belonged to you. If you recognize yourself as someone who has repeatedly sacrificed your own emotional well-being while trying to save a relationship, repair another person's wounds, or hold everything together until you became completely exhausted, then this message is speaking directly to you. Venus joined with the South Node in Virgo shines a powerful light on a pattern that many people never realize they're repeating. Beneath what we often describe as love, loyalty, dedication, or caring, there may actually be an unconscious desire to maintain control. We convince ourselves that constant problem-solving proves our affection. We call it service. We call it commitment. We call it responsibility. Yet underneath those beautiful names may live a frightened part of ourselves that believes perfect management is the only way to guarantee emotional safety. We imagine that if we can anticipate every conflict, regulate another person's emotions, improve every weakness, predict every challenge, and keep every detail under control, then perhaps abandonment will never happen. Perhaps rejection can be avoided. Perhaps pain can finally be prevented. This pattern reaches much deeper than ordinary behavior. It often reflects an emotional survival strategy formed long before adulthood. Somewhere in childhood, whether through watching your parents, experiencing unpredictable affection, or learning difficult emotional lessons too early, a belief may have quietly taken root. Love must be earned. Acceptance depends on usefulness. If you stop fixing problems, your value disappears. If you stop carrying everyone else, no one will remain beside you. Without realizing it, you become the dependable one, the rescuer, the person everyone relies upon, while your own emotional needs remain hidden beneath layers of responsibility. You become so skilled at keeping other people together that almost no one notices you are slowly breaking apart inside. Today, the North Node in Pisces directs an entirely different message toward that exhausted version of yourself. It gently reminds you that you no longer need to carry what was never yours. You are allowed to set the burden down. Releasing control is not the same as abandoning love. In fact, authentic love was never designed to function like a project requiring constant supervision. It was meant to become an experience of trust, openness, and surrender. That final word often creates immediate resistance because surrender sounds frightening to anyone who has built an identity around competence, reliability, and constant responsibility. Yet this is precisely the invitation contained within today's alignment. Can you remain present even when the outcome is uncertain? Can you love another person without trying to improve every aspect of who they are? Can you allow a relationship to exist with imperfections instead of constantly reaching for another solution? These questions are not theoretical. They become increasingly urgent because another powerful astrological event is approaching. On July 13th, Venus forms a square with Uranus. Unlike the gentle invitation offered by today's energy, Uranus rarely negotiates. Uranus disrupts whatever has become too rigid. It breaks apart whatever is held with excessive force. If you continue tightening your grip through control, correction, management, and emotional micromanagement, the pressure may eventually become too great to sustain. Whatever you refuse to release voluntarily may be separated from you through sudden change instead. This is not punishment. It is liberation arriving in a form that feels impossible to ignore. That is why this moment offers a meaningful choice before that next wave arrives. You can loosen your grip willingly through awareness and acceptance today, or life may accomplish the same lesson through unexpected events within the next 48 hours. I sincerely believe the gentler path is the wiser one. There is one final caution before we move forward because it connects directly to everything we have explored so far. Over the coming days, an old emotional road may begin calling your name with remarkable persistence. It will sound convincing. It will feel familiar. It will seem comforting in ways that are almost impossible to question. That invitation may disguise itself as healing, closure, destiny, or even love itself. Yet appearances can be incredibly persuasive during karmic moments like this. The choice I mentioned earlier, the one that so many people will overlook, begins here because the greatest temptation rarely presents itself as an obvious mistake. Instead, it arrives wearing the comforting face of home, making discernment more essential than ever before. Let me explain why this particular energy feels so difficult to resist. The South Node does not persuade you through logic. It works much more like gravity, an invisible force that quietly pulls you toward emotional territory your soul has traveled countless times before. It draws your attention toward relationship patterns that have become deeply familiar through repetition, toward the kinds of connections that seem to find you over and over again, even after you promised yourself that you would never repeat them. It calls you back to the personalities that awaken the same hopes, the same disappointments, and the same emotional negotiations that have shaped so many chapters of your life. These dynamics become so familiar that they begin feeling almost automatic, as natural as breathing itself, even while they are gradually draining your spirit. That is why today's alignment deserves your complete awareness. Venus is sitting directly upon that karmic point, amplifying the magnetic pull of the South Node with extraordinary precision. As this influence reaches its peak, you may find yourself feeling almost irresistibly drawn towards someone who activates every unresolved wound you still carry beneath the surface. Perhaps it is the emotionally unavailable person who always leaves you searching for reassurance. Perhaps it is someone whose affection always feels uncertain enough to make you work harder for it. Perhaps it is the familiar cycle where you continue giving more of yourself, sacrificing more of your energy, offering more patience, more understanding, and more compassion, while secretly hoping that this time your devotion will finally be enough to earn the love you have always wanted. The emotional attraction may feel overwhelming because your body recognizes the pattern long before your conscious mind begins questioning it. Your nervous system interprets familiarity as certainty. It mistakes repetition for security. Yet this is one of the most important truths this transit asks you to recognize. Something can feel deeply familiar without being emotionally healthy. Something can remind you of home, while simultaneously preventing you from growing into the future your soul is trying to create. Familiarity and genuine safety are not identical experiences, even though they often feel indistinguishable in the moment. Simply because a connection awakens old emotional comfort does not automatically mean it belongs in the next chapter of your life. There is another remarkable development arriving almost immediately after today's opposition that dramatically changes the emotional landscape. On July 12th, positioned perfectly between the Venus opposition to the nodal axis and the approaching Venus square to Uranus-Mercury, while still retrograde, enters an extraordinary condition known as a cazimi. At that precise moment, Mercury moves directly into the heart of the Sun in Cancer. Astrologically, this is often experienced as a profound illumination of the emotional mind. Imagine someone suddenly opening every curtain inside a room that has remained dimly lit for years. The details that once existed only as vague feelings suddenly become unmistakably clear. Instead of simply reacting to old emotional patterns, you begin understanding where they came from. The story beneath the story becomes visible. You recognize the childhood experience that first shaped your beliefs about love. You begin seeing the family dynamics that quietly taught you what relationships were supposed to look like. You may even recognize ancestral emotional patterns that have been passed from one generation to another without anyone fully understanding how deeply they influenced the way affection, sacrifice, approval, and belonging were expressed. This realization is far more powerful than ordinary insight because it is not limited to intellectual understanding. It arrives as something your entire being recognizes simultaneously. Your mind understands it, your emotions confirm it, your body feels it. It resembles the sensation of searching for the final missing piece of a puzzle for years, only to watch it suddenly fall perfectly into place. That clarity is one of the greatest gifts hidden within this sequence of transits. The universe is not simply revealing your patterns in order to make you uncomfortable. It is providing the awareness necessary to choose differently. Once the root becomes visible, you cannot honestly pretend it is still invisible. Once you recognize the cycle for what it truly is, it becomes much more difficult to surrender your future to it again. That awareness creates something incredibly valuable. It gives you the freedom to decline what once felt irresistible, not because resentment has taken over, not because anger has hardened your heart, not because bitterness has convinced you to stop loving. Instead, your answer begins coming from a place of quiet self-respect that no longer needs to defend itself. The invisible bond that has connected you to old pain is often described as a karmic cord, and whether you interpret that symbolically or spiritually, its emotional reality can be remarkably powerful. It is woven from unresolved grief, promises that were never fulfilled, attachments that never fully healed, and emotional inheritance passed quietly through generations. Throughout this weekend, you are being offered a rare opportunity to release that connection, not through conflict, revenge, or emotional violence, but through compassion toward the version of yourself who first created it, and unwavering commitment toward the person you are becoming now. As that old attachment begins loosening, another possibility gradually appears before you. The North Node in Pisces stands on the opposite side of this entire process, extending an invitation into a completely different experience of love. It offers the possibility of relationships that are not sustained through suffering. Relationships that do not require endless sacrifice before affection is returned. Relationships where acceptance is not conditional upon constant performance. Relationships where love is allowed to flow naturally instead of being forced through effort, exhaustion, or self-abandonment. For many people, that possibility is surprisingly frightening because pain is often felt more predictable than peace. We know how to survive struggle. We know how to navigate uncertainty. Receiving uncomplicated love, however, may feel unfamiliar enough to awaken fear instead of comfort. That realization leads directly into another lesson unfolding through these extraordinary planetary movements, one that reaches into the deepest psychological foundations of how many people measure love itself. This next choice may prove to be the most emotionally challenging of all because it asks you to examine motivations that usually remain hidden beneath everyday behavior. On July 13th, the sky forms an exceptionally rare configuration known as a yod, often called the finger of fate. During this remarkable alignment, Neptune in Aries and Pluto in Aquarius each create intensely pressurized aspects with Venus in Virgo. Venus becomes positioned at the apex of the formation, the focal point where every current of energy converges into one unavoidable emotional lesson. That lesson is both simple and profoundly difficult. Stop measuring love like a balance sheet. Many of us carry an invisible ledger into our closest relationships without ever realizing it. We rarely admit it aloud because it does not appear cruel or intentional. Yet somewhere beneath the surface, we quietly record emotional exchanges. We remember every sacrifice we made. We notice every time we were present for another person's struggles. We compare how much we have invested with how much we believe has been returned. We tell ourselves that if we showed up when they needed us, surely they should have done the same. We wonder why our endless giving still leaves us feeling emotionally depleted. The old shines an uncompromising light upon this hidden accounting system. It reveals that the ledger is not actually an expression of love. It is a protective strategy built upon fear. It grows from the belief that your natural existence is somehow insufficient, that affection must always be earned through effort, usefulness, productivity, perfection, or constant service. This is one of the deepest shadow expressions of Venus moving through Virgo. Beneath every helpful action, beneath every attempt to improve organize, fix, or contribute, an unconscious equation may be operating quietly in the background. It keeps repeating the same painful message. If I become useful enough, if I work hard enough, if I perform well enough, if I make myself indispensable enough, then perhaps I will finally become worthy of receiving the love I have been searching for all along. When that kind of love never fully arrives, or even when it appears but somehow still leaves an emptiness inside you, something almost invisible begins growing beneath the surface. Quiet disappointment slowly transforms into silent resentment. The emotional accounting book becomes heavier with every sacrifice you remember, every effort you believe went unnoticed, every moment you convinced yourself that you had given more than you received. Without realizing it, the walls surrounding your heart become stronger than the love you were trying to protect. This is exactly where the current planetary picture becomes so profound. Pluto, the force that exposes psychological truth without compromise, is dismantling those protective walls piece by piece. At the very same time, Neptune, whose nature is to dissolve illusions and soften rigid boundaries, is washing away the belief that love can ever be measured through emotional transactions. Together, they place Venus directly in the center of an unmistakable spiritual decision. Continue treating love like an exchange that demands repayment, or allow that entire structure to collapse so something far more authentic can finally take its place. That may sound overwhelming, yet the symbolism unfolding in the sky suggests precisely that kind of transformation. Genuine unconditional love has never meant allowing yourself to be mistreated or abandoning healthy boundaries. It has never required sacrificing your dignity or accepting behavior that diminishes your spirit. Instead, it asks something much deeper. It asks whether you can release the expectation that every act of love must eventually be returned in equal measure. It invites you to love because love reflects your true nature rather than because you are hoping to secure validation, security, or emotional compensation. That invitation requires extraordinary courage because it demands a belief that many people have never fully embraced. It asks you to trust, with complete sincerity, that your existence alone makes you worthy of love, not your achievements, not your usefulness, not your productivity, not your ability to solve everyone else's problems, not your perfection, simply your existence. If this weekend allows you to take even a small step toward embracing that truth, the effects could ripple through every area of your life. Relationships begin changing because you stop searching for constant proof that you deserve affection. Financial decisions shift because your sense of value is no longer rooted in endless performance. Your relationship with yourself softens because you stop demanding impossible standards before allowing yourself peace. Venus governs much more than romance. Venus governs value itself. The moment you stop believing your worth must be earned again and again through endless effort, something inside your entire being finally exhales. Fear begins losing its grip. The constant pressure to prove yourself gradually fades. As that inner tension dissolves, the people, opportunities, and experiences that genuinely resonate with your authentic value find far less resistance. They are no longer blocked by the old belief that you must first become enough before receiving what has always been available to you. This is why the timing of the current transit deserves such careful attention. Its influence extends far beyond a single weekend. In many ways, it echoes forward for the next 18 years, around July 27th. Only about 2 weeks after this Venus opposition, the lunar nodes complete their passage through Virgo and Pisces. They enter Aquarius and Leo, closing an important karmic chapter that began in early 2025. Once they leave this axis, they will not return for approximately 18 years. That means every lesson connected with healing, surrender, service, perfectionism, trust, and faith has been building toward this very moment. The exact Venus opposition on July 11th functions like the final and most concentrated examination within that entire cycle. It is the universe asking one final question before the curriculum concludes. Have you truly learned what these past months have been trying to teach you, or are you still carrying the same emotional habits into the future? The answer will not be determined by what you think. It will be revealed by what you choose. Every decision made during this weekend carries unusual significance. If you release the outdated emotional patterns now, you enter the next nodal cycle with remarkable freedom, prepared for entirely new experiences, without the burden of unfinished karmic weight. If, however, Those unresolved patterns remain tightly held. They accompany you into the Aquarius and Leo cycle, a chapter that emphasizes community, authenticity, broader vision, and emotional objectivity. Carrying unnecessary emotional baggage into that environment becomes increasingly difficult because the new cycle asks for openness instead of attachment, expansion instead of repetition. The opportunity before you is genuine, yet it will not remain open forever. Before we finish, there is one more group of people I want to address directly, because this alignment is likely speaking to them with exceptional intensity. If your birth chart contains significant placements in Gemini, Virgo, Sagittarius, or Pisces, especially your Sun, Moon, Rising, or Venus, these transits may already feel impossible to ignore. You may sense yourself being pulled in several emotional directions at once. Restlessness may have become unusually strong. Anxiety may seem to rise without an obvious external cause. You might carry an unmistakable feeling that something within your life must change, even though the exact answer remains just beyond your reach. Those sensations reflect the mutable T-square, becoming highly activated within your chart. Its purpose is not to create discomfort without meaning. Instead, it continues applying pressure until you consciously decide how you wish to experience love moving forward. That decision cannot be postponed indefinitely. If these descriptions resonate with you, honor this weekend instead of distracting yourself from it. Spend time writing your thoughts, reflect honestly on what continues repeating within your relationships. Allow yourself to have conversations that may feel uncomfortable but necessary. Resist the temptation to scroll endlessly in search of temporary escape. Sit quietly with your emotions instead. Listen carefully to what they are trying to reveal. I sincerely believe that the decisions made throughout these next 72 hours will influence the emotional tone of your relationships for much longer than you currently realize. The coming 72 hours are not simply passing time. They are participating in your transformation. Before we close, let us step back and see the entire sequence as one unfolding journey. Today, July 11th, Venus stands opposite the North Node. The mirror of karma is lifted before you. Hidden relationship patterns become visible. Familiar faces from the past may reappear, and the three profound emotional choices stand waiting for your response. On July 12th, Mercury, while retrograde, reaches its cazimi within the heart of the Sun in Cancer. The emotional origins of your patterns become illuminated with extraordinary clarity. You finally understand not only what you have been repeating, but why you have been repeating it. The insight arrives powerfully, although it remains available only for a brief window. Then comes July 13th. Venus forms its square with Uranus while simultaneously activating the yod. Whatever attachments remain tightly held despite all the previous invitations to release them are challenged directly. Sudden changes arrive. Long-standing structures begin cracking. Truths that have been postponed refuse to remain hidden any longer. Finally, on July 14th, the new moon in Cancer opens an entirely different chapter. After exposure, after understanding, after disruption, there comes renewal. Fresh emotional ground becomes available, inviting you to plant entirely new intentions where old passions once stood. This is the complete arc of the weekend. First comes revelation, then understanding, then liberation through change. Finally, the opportunity for emotional rebirth. Every stage belongs to the same unfolding process, and you are living through each one in real time. I will not pretend that this journey asks very little of you, because it does not. It demands honesty, courage, patience, and compassion toward yourself. Yet I genuinely believe the transformation waiting beyond this passage is worth every uncomfortable moment it requires. On the other side stands a version of you that no longer believes love must be earned through perfection, sacrifice, or endless emotional performance. A version of you that loves without fear, without hidden calculations, without carrying invisible ledgers into every relationship. Perhaps that version of yourself has been quietly waiting for this exact weekend all along. Before we part, I simply want to thank you for sharing this time with me. If you have stayed through this entire conversation, I truly appreciate your presence. If these insights spoke to your heart, I would be grateful if you subscribed to continue exploring these astrological journeys together. I would also love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me which of the three karmic choices resonated with you most deeply, because every shared experience helps remind us that none of us walks this path alone. Until we meet again, be patient with yourself throughout this remarkable weekend. Treat your heart with kindness, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.